The story that you tell, what is that favorite family story that reminds you of why it is that you're proud to be a member of your family? The story that you tell that reminds you of what it means to bear your last name. What's your favorite family story? The stories that we tell are stories that have often shaped us and molded us. The stories that we tell are the ones that left an imprint on our lives. What is that story for you? For the Rogers family, one of the stories that we tell in our home that has shaped us and formed us into the family that we are today is the story of the adoption of our daughter, Bella. That entire journey from when she was placed in our home at 2 days old through the entire time she was under care of the foster care system to her adoption on National Adoption Day, which was November 21st of 2015, to her baptism on the 22nd, the very next day, when every single one of her caseworkers who oversaw her case came to the church to witness her becoming a member not only of the Rogers family, but of the very household of God. That whole story is one that left an indelible mark on our family because it changed for us what it means to be family. If you've never met Bella, Bella's unique in our family in that she looks nothing like us. She had a mom who was African American and a dad who was Hispanic, and therefore, for us, being a family no longer looks like sharing the same external appearances. It's not about eye color or hair texture or color or even whether it's straight or curly. For us, it's not about internal markers such as DNA. It goes much deeper than that. Indeed, family for us has everything to do with the quality of our relationships, the promises that we've made to one another, and the love that we share. This central story of our family has forever changed for us what it means to be a family. The stories that we tell convey with them what is important to us. They, in some ways, define culture for us. So you can listen to the stories of the world and hear in them the scenes and the spirit of the times. The stories that we tell can often shape the culture as it is being developed. Why the stories that we tell sometimes help us understand our past. By looking at the events and how they're told, it helps us come to see what is actually important in life. And as we understand our past, the stories actually help us to interpret our present. And our stories also enable us to look to the future and dream dreams and hopes anew. The stories we tell are powerful. As a result, we need to listen to the stories that are being told today. What are the central events? Who has a voice in the story? Or perhaps even more difficult, who doesn't have a voice? Who has authority, either formal or informal authority? What are the stories that are being told today? Stories are powerful. I think it's interesting then that our scriptures, by and large, are told mostly by the account of stories. If you look back to the Old Testament, so much of the Old Testament is the story of God's people, understanding God's providential hand throughout time. Even in the New Testament, when Jesus is speaking about the complex realities of the kingdom of God and how it's breaking forth in our midst in Him, Jesus uses stories and parables to help us understand the meaning and significance of that. And even the Gospels themselves, one of which we're going to look at today, is a story that helps us to know who Christ is and what He came to do. The stories we tell are powerful. And today we're going to hear a story that is drenched in authority. You know, our nation actually has a really interesting history with authority. The very genesis of our nation was a rebellion of sorts against a foreign occupational authority. It was a rebellion, a declaration of independence, because there was this spirit of independence in this birthed nation here. And so our forefathers sought to create for us a nation that was governed by the people and for the people. And so the great words of our Declaration of Independence say these words: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men were created equal, that they were endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." In other words, our forefathers had this suspicion of authority, so they sought to limit the powers of government to the consent of the people, and they even included the right for us to, if the government started impinging upon our unalienable and God-given rights, that we had the ability to reform and to make changes to that, because they knew, as brilliant as they were, that they weren't always going to get it right. So even in that authority, there's this suspicion of authority that exists, because they knew that absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. But they also knew that that wasn't a problem just for those in authority, but that human nature was fundamentally broken, and that we needed a government over us to give us order and to protect our rights. This is the story of the founding of our nation. And it's a powerful story that actually can lead us into the future. One of my favorite ways in which this story helped us to interpret the present and reinterpret what the future was going to be like was in the brilliant leadership of the 1960s. That was a turbulent time for our country. The 60s were a time where authority was being questioned on all sorts of different fronts. And the civil rights movement of the 60s did a brilliant job of leveraging the founding of our country for a new hope together. As of late, amidst the challenges that our nation is experiencing with racial tension and unrest between people groups, I've been rereading snippets of one of our former summer reads. Do you remember the book that we read a couple of summers ago, If You Can Keep It, by Eric Metaxas? There's a section in there where he talks quite a bit about the civil rights movement and the need for our country to reform in terms of its sense of racial equality. And he quotes Dr. Martin Luther King in that section, and he says these words: "Martin Luther King Jr. said that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence before it constituted a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir." And then Metaxas goes on to say his own words: "It was a promise that was not fulfilled instantly, and that was not fulfilled in King's Day, and that has not yet been fulfilled in ours, at least not in full. It was a promise that is being fulfilled and that must keep on being fulfilled, and we are the ones who must fulfill it, who must keep that promise." Because our Declaration of Independence gave the power to the people to make the changes. What I love about this story is King and Metaxas after him looked at the history of our nation, the story that we tell, and they reinterpreted the present, and they set a dream and a hope and a vision of what one day we could be. This is the power of story. And today, we're going to read a powerful story that talks about authority. And it's one in which we as Americans ought to love. But before we do that, just one other quick little note about authority. Have you ever observed that sometimes people have positional authority, but the actual real authority lies somewhere else? Like somebody has a title like CEO, and yet the real authority to make decisions falls on somebody else. This is actually the story of Google. Eric Schmidt became the CEO of Google, and he was given that title, but he quickly realized that the true authority actually resided in the two founders who were still present. So he had to learn to navigate in a world of delegated authority as opposed to the one that he thought he actually had total authority to make decisions for the company. But you know what, there's another example that's a little bit closer to home. Maybe you've had this experience. Have you ever had a spouse ask you the question, where would you like to go for dinner? And at first, it seemed as though your spouse was conferring the responsibility of decision-making on your shoulders, and so you reply with a couple of suggestions which are quickly subverted. And you realize, because you're a wise spouse and you've been doing this for some time, that was just a conversation starter, and that the real authority to make the decision is still on their shoulders, and so you reply, okay, where would you like to go for dinner? Sometimes authority appears to be in a position, and yet it lies somewhere else. That's actually the story of the passage we're going to read. Because we're going to meet a Roman centurion, a man of authority delegated by Rome for him. And yet it raises a sort of interesting subversive question as to where the actual authority lies. This is Luke chapter 7, verses 1 through 10. When Jesus had finished saying all this to the people who were listening, he entered Capernaum. There, a centurion's servant, whom his master valued highly, was sick and about to die. The centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him. This man deserves to have this done because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue. So Jesus went with them. He was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to him to say, Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. That is why I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you, but say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him. And turning to the crowd following him, he said, I tell you, I have not found such great faith, even in Israel. Then the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well. As an American people, we ought to love this story because there's an apparent power in Caesarea. It's a delegated authority from across the sea, right? It's the power of Rome in a local region, and it's a subversive story about how the true authority doesn't rely with that foreign occupying power. We ought to love this story. A couple of years ago, I read a book by a lecturer and author by the name of Barbara Kellerman with somewhat of a provocative title. The title of the book was The End of Leadership. It was a book that was essentially about how authority in the Western world is shifting dramatically. In the book, Barbara says that increasingly, authority has been located in the individual. Increasingly, authority has been located in the individual, and she goes on to cite 3 ways in which this has happened. She says the growing pluralism of religion and spirituality in the Western world is one reason. The consumerism of our culture, which says that the customer is always right, places more and more authority in the people. And then finally, she says that the advent of the internet and the technological advances have given more and more authority to individuals to have power and influence in their world. How true this is today. Why, in the corporate world? In the corporate world, the pace of change has sped up so quickly that no longer do organizations have the luxury of having decisions get funneled up the chain of command only to get distributed with decisions going down. So more and more authority and decision-making power is falling on employees. And not only decision-making power, but where they're going to work from. And what their hours are going to be. Employees are getting more and more authority. And this is happening in our technological world too. Have you noticed today, have you seen this happen at all recently? Where somebody will post something online, a video or something like that, and it will go viral. And after it goes viral, it affects change locally, nationally, and even around the world. It seems like everybody today has this proverbial bullhorn to promote their ideas to the world. More and more authority is being given to individuals. We love this as an American culture, which is founded on us conferring authority on other people so that the true authority resides in us. We love this. And also, I wonder if we need to be very, very careful today. I'm actually struck by the way the word authority and the word author share the same root. Because today, everybody has the ability to tell their story and interpret for us what events are important, what things we need to pay attention to, and to shape the culture of our nation. Everybody is telling powerful stories, and here's the problem with more and more authority being given to individuals to tell their own stories. We have stories that are going like this, and we can no longer even hear one another. The stories are too divergent. Luke, the writer of the Gospel of Luke, is a masterful storyteller. I think we can actually learn a lot by looking at some of the details of the passage that we just read as it pertains to authority. Luke begins in verse 1 by telling us that Jesus entered into Capernaum. Now, we know because of verse 9 that Jesus was actually traveling with a group of people. And we also know that Jesus in chapter 6 had been teaching this massive crowd of people from Jerusalem and Judea, from Tyre and Sidon, from all over Galilee. And yet when Luke starts this account, he says, "And Jesus entered into Capernaum." Conversely, there's a centurion in town. The word centurion, you may hear the same root for the word century. The centurion had at least 100 soldiers, military men, under his authority. Jesus is depicted as coming in alone. The authority of the centurion is spread to 100 men. It's almost as though Luke is creating this contrast between Jesus and the centurion. Who seems to have all the authority in this passage? Jesus, who enters by himself, or the centurion? It seemed to be the centurion, wouldn't it? And centurions were the backbone of the Roman world. They were the people who got things done locally for the government who was far, far away. And this particular centurion was probably serving one of two direct reports. We're not sure exactly which one. The first one that we think maybe he was serving was Herod the Tetrarch of Galilee. Does this name ring a bell? In 2 chapters, Luke is going to tell us, almost in passing, that it's this Herod that beheads John the Baptist. It's this Herod who's going to become prominent in the story of Jesus' trial and his ultimate crucifixion. This is probably one of the direct reports for the centurion. And if it wasn't Herod the Tetrarch of Galilee, the other option is not much better. It's Pontius Pilate, who's stationed in Caesarea. Either of those two direct reports were involved in the crucifixion of Jesus. Therefore, in some ways, he has the delegated authority of the Roman Empire who's going to seek Jesus' life. Interesting to note. The centurion not only has 100 men at his disposal, he also has servants. We know this because one of the servants gets sick. That's actually the reason that Jesus gets called to his home. And if that wasn't enough, This Roman centurion had gone into Capernaum, and he had done what so many centurions in other parts of the Roman world had done. He leveraged the financial resourcing of Rome to build the synagogue. In other words, he made the Jewish people indebted to Rome so that when he ever needed a favor, he could call on them. Who has all the authority in this passage? Well, it would seem to be the centurion, except that there's one thing he couldn't do. He couldn't make a sick man well. He probably heard of Jesus. In fact, Jesus had been to Capernaum one other time according to the Gospel of Luke. It was in chapter 4. Jesus went to the very synagogue that the centurion helped fund the building of, and there he preached in the synagogue, and people marveled at what he said, and they said, "This man teaches as somebody who's got authority." And then after he taught in the synagogue, he cast out an impure spirit from somebody. And they said, "Look, even his words have power and authority to them." So when Jesus left Capernaum last time, everybody was saying, "This man is a man of true authority." So the centurion had heard of him. And for that reason, he sought him out when there was something he couldn't do. But did you notice the detail of who he sent to go to Jesus? The centurion sent a couple of elders from the local synagogue. He had 100 men he could have sent. He had some servants that he could have sent, but he sent the elders from the local synagogue to ask Jesus to come heal his servant. Which raises a really interesting question. Why would he do this? The answer to this question actually lies in the complicated dynamics of the first century relationship between Jews and Gentiles. There was somewhat of a rift between the two. Now, the Roman centurion was a Gentile man, meaning he was a non-Jewish man. And as a non-Jewish man, he actually became a God-fearer. So though he embodied Rome in some ways, which was somewhat of the enemy of Christ, though he embodied Rome, he may have been a God-fearer who was attracted to Judaism because of its monotheistic characteristics. In the midst of a world that had a God for everything, he was drawn to Judaism. And probably he was drawn to Judaism because of its strict moral ethic in the midst of a world with incredible immorality. So it's probably true that as a Gentile man, he became a convert to Judaism without having the external rites of that conversion. And he may have even been worshiping in the synagogue. And he may have been there that morning when Jesus was there and taught with authority and cast out an impure spirit. And so he may have been a man of faith. In fact, that's what Jesus commends him as. And whereas he would have had no issue as a Gentile man relating with a Jewish individual, any moderately Orthodox Jew in the first century world would never go to the home of a Gentile. Think about the story of the Israelite people to try to understand this. The Israelite people had been plucked out of a Gentile nation and set free in the promised land in order that they would worship God and worship God alone. And God reminded them repeatedly, don't associate yourselves with the peoples in which the land in which I'm going to send you. Don't associate with them, so otherwise you might bow down to their foreign gods. And so they were taught to remain separate. So for a Jewish man in the first century world to enter the home of a Gentile would have made Jesus ceremonially unclean. So the Roman centurion sends some Jewish elders to Jesus and says, "Can you come heal my servant?" And without a single word, Jesus goes. This would have shocked everybody in the ancient world. The Jewish elders must have been like, "Are you kidding me? You're going to go to this man's house, this Gentile man's home? I mean, we know he's got all sorts of power, but you're going to go there?" And Jesus goes. It shocks the centurion so much, he sends a second delegation of individuals, this time a group of his friends, to say to him, Jesus, we know that you've got authority. I'm a man under authority too. I can say to this guy, come, and he comes, and that guy, go, and he goes. You're a man of authority. Just say the word, and my servant will be made well. In other words, I'm not worthy to have you come to my house. I know what this is going to cost you if you come here. Don't worry about it. Yet Jesus demonstrates a willingness to go. Jesus was willing to rise above the stories of the world and to enter into a place that doesn't seem like he should go. I sometimes wonder how this story impacted the rest of Christian history. Because Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke, and he wrote a sequel to the Gospel of Luke called the Book of Acts. And there is an interesting parallel account to this story. Instead of Jesus and a centurion who invites him to come to his home, it is Peter, the disciple of Jesus, and a man by the name of Cornelius. Cornelius sends a delegation of individuals to Peter and says, can you come to my home and tell me about this Jesus? Peter needs a vision from God to convince him to go. He needs a vision from God that concludes with, how dare you call somebody unclean that I have made clean? So he's willing to then go, and he goes into this home, and he becomes the first Gentile convert, another centurion. I wonder if, as Peter was sitting on the roof having this vision and God was speaking to him, if he remembered this story as he was traveling around with Jesus, as he remembered that Jesus was willing to rise above the stories of the time and enter into this home. And if that helped him interpret his present and set up a new and hopeful future. And where the whole narrative of Luke into Acts goes is that this religion that was for a small subset of people became a religion for every people, race, tribe, and tongue. It was the story of the gospel reaching the ends of the earth, such that you and I today, who are non-Jewish individuals, who are Gentiles, have been included in the family of faith. This is our story. And I think the roots of it are in Luke 7. What a powerful story. There are a lot of stories that are being told today. Individuals have the power to author their own narratives about what's happening in the world. Oftentimes these stories go like this and cross paths, and they're radically divergent, and it doesn't seem like anybody is actually listening or hearing each other. And I think this passage speaks profoundly to the world that we live in today. So as we tie this up, I want to suggest to you very humbly what I think 3 takeaways are to allow this story to help us interpret this time for the future that God is calling us to. Number 1, Jesus is the author of life. That's what Luke calls him later on in the book of Acts. Jesus is the author of life. He's the one who has true authority. It is the story that Jesus tells that ought to be our foundational story as a people, because he's the only one that really matters. He is God speaking to us what is really important, and that ought to shape our habits, our beliefs, the way we act in the world. It is Jesus who needs to author our story as a people. And secondly, did you notice that Jesus transcends all the stories that are being told? Amidst a group of people who would have been separated by race and culture and ethnicity and history, Jesus transcends all of that. And he is willing to go where God calls him to go, even if it costs him something. Yet he does it. I know. There are a lot of stories being told today. I know some of those stories, when you just hear a few words of them or a snippet of them, it starts to make us flush in the face and angry and upset, because it seems like nobody is hearing one another, and it seems like a radically different story than we've ever heard before. And yet Jesus, as the author of our story, as the one in whom we ought to ground our story, rises above the narratives that are being told in his time, and so should we. And finally, if Jesus is the author of life, and he's the one that declares what our story ought to be, and if he's the one that transcends the stories, we need to look to his story for clues about how we should be as a people. And Jesus started a movement where Paul would later say there is neither Jew nor Gentile, but he tore down the barrier of hostility between the two. And he became a minister of reconciliation. You know, when Paul was describing what role Christians have in the world, he called us ministers of reconciliation. It's my conviction that the church has a story to tell that is powerful amidst this time, and we have a story to tell of reconciliation. One that is grounded in Jesus Christ, that transcends the narratives that are going on right now, but that plays an active role in shaping the world in which we live. I think we have a role to play, a story to tell for such a time as this. Let me close with this. The stories we tell are the stories that shaped us the most. The story of our family is a story where we are not a family because of the way we look, because of our ancestry or our DNA, but we are a family because of the promises that we've made to each other, because of the love we share and the relationships that we have. As Christians, we have been adopted. That's the word that Paul uses. We have been adopted into a multicultural, multiracial family of faith where what unites us is so much greater than what divides us. It's the very love of God expressed to us in Jesus Christ. My friends, this is the story of our faith. It's a story that needs to be told today. It's a story I want to give my life to. What story is your life telling? Would you pray with me? Holy God, we give you thanks. You are the author of life. Our entire story, the story of all humanity, is grounded in you. And you modeled for us what it's like to rise above the divisions of culture and race and story and narrative and to enter into human brokenness and bring the dividing wall of hostility down. Lord, this is our story. This is a story that our world needs. Grant to us individually and corporately the gift of knowing how to listen to the stories of our time and to gently and lovingly share the story of our faith as ministers of reconciliation in Jesus Christ. We pray all these things in the strong name of the risen Christ. Amen.
He knows where you are and what you're going through. He feels your pain and sees your tears. His hand reaches out to help you on your way, and every word you pray, he hears. He will shine in your dark streets, the streets. We give what we have, our sin and brokenness. He takes upon his back our guilt. He gives what he has, his comfort, strength, and hope, the hope and future he has built. He will shine in your dark streets, the everlasting light. All your fears and sorrows are conquered in his might. When you walk in a darkness that you cannot explain, the love of Jesus is your light in the dark streets. In the darkest night, you have a place to hide. The Father of all light sends Jesus to your side. He will shine in your dark streets, the everlasting light. All your fears and sorrows are conquered in his might. When you walk in a darkness that you